Deborah, you spent 40 years in broadcasting, and at the end of it you ended up with an MBE for Services to Science. That sounds pretty impressive. But how did it all start?
I started off, actually, I'd always had an interest in journalism and all kinds of things. So when I was looking to go to university, I thought if I did something like engineering science, that would give me a broader range of subjects. In fact, I discovered I was completely wrong. So after about 6 weeks of studying engineering, I realised actually I should have probably been doing physics in the first place. And I was at Durham University, and I persuaded them to change course, and I also had the opportunity to do history and philosophy of science, which I was also very interested in as a subsidiary in my first year. So I did that. Then I did a physics degree. While I was at university, I did do some writing for the student magazine that was called Platinate. Not on science at all, because I don't think there was any interest in science in the student newspaper. I did a few theatre reviews, actually. I remember going to the Edinburgh Festival and writing about some plays I saw there. And then when I'd finished, I thought, I'd like to broaden my studies. So I applied to do a master's in social studies in science in a department at Manchester University called Liberal Studies in Science. So I did a master's there, which was quite liberating after a physics degree, in that we did bits of sociology of science, philosophy of science, economic history. I even did a course on science of religion, actually. And then I wrote my thesis about science in the alternative press, which there was quite a lot of it around in the 70s. And also by that time, I'd started doing a little bits of journalism for a magazine in Manchester called the New Manchester Review, which was a bit like Time Out was in London in those days, which was bits of journalism, bits of listings, bits of reviews. So that's sort of where I cut my teeth. I didn't do any radio because there weren't student radio stations at either of the places I was at, or not the ones that I was aware of.
Were you, as I was, not very good at maths, or were you good at it? Because to move on, as it were, perhaps if you wanted to do research or something like that, you really did need the maths.
Well, I was quite good at maths until we got to, I think, year 3 of my degree. And I, for some crazy reason, chose to do a theoretical physics option. And then I thought, this maths is too hard. I really lost it. I liked the maths that was more applied, which is why I thought I was more of a physicist than a mathematician. Yes. So it did get to the point that I thought some of the very complicated calculus that had to be done was a bit beyond me.
But all these other things you did after your physics seems to me to have been much more useful when it comes to broadcasting.
Yes, I think they were. I think it gave me a much broader view of how science works in culture and in society and politics, which I think did set me up quite well. That's not to say you have to do that, because I think quite a few people these days, more recently, have done more specific science communication courses, which do a mixture. They do a little bit of the science in society bit, but they possibly don't do the broader range of things that I managed to do in that course, which doesn't exist anymore. It was, I'm not sure when it stopped, but I thought it was a very good grounding.
So after that, how did you start getting interested then in broadcasting? You said there were no student radio stations, but you had a connection with the media.
Well, I did, and I realised this is what I wanted to do, which, most careers people just sort of said, oh, think about something more sensible than that. But I just started applying for jobs. I did a project with the Council for Voluntary Service, creating a directory when I finished my master's. And then I just started applying for jobs. And I probably assumed that I would get a job in print media, because obviously that was what I knew slightly more about. But then there was a job advertised in The Guardian, I think, for a producer in the radio science unit. And I was a listener to Science Now, which was, now I've discovered, of course, it was quite new in the late 70s, even though obviously it seemed to me like it had been something that had been on Radio 4 forever, that I used to listen to. So I was at least aware of, I did listen to Radio 4. And I applied for this role thinking, it's one of those things, I think when you go for a job, you think you haven't got any chance of ever getting. But they interviewed me, and actually they interviewed me twice. In those days, the BBC did a lot of interviewing to get people into jobs, with big panels of people as well, as you might remember.
Was this a 5 Portland Place job?
It was. The second one was. I think the first one was just a couple of people, but the second one was a panel of 4 people in 5 Portland Place, including someone from personnel and someone from appointments, which were different departments. I'm sure you remember,
I do,
remember that
absolutely,
as well.
yes. I also remember the fish tank in 5 Portland Place, which when I went for my interview, I spent most of the time looking at it because it was leaking onto the floor.
Maybe they'd fixed it by the time.
Yeah, maybe not. Okay,
Yeah.
so you went for
Yeah.
an interview specifically for the science unit.
Yes, it was a specific job as a producer of the science unit. Now, they didn't give me that, which was no big surprise because I had no experience. But they offered me a 6-month contract as a researcher, which in those days was, I was a freelance effectively on a 6-month contract, which I took. And I started in March 1979. And there was me as a researcher. There was a woman called Alison Richards, who is now in America. She's worked for NPR for a long time, who had got the producer role. And she'd come from the museum world. She didn't have a science degree. She was an English graduate, actually, from Oxford. And we were extremely small unit. There was an editor. I think he was called an editor. He might even have been a chief producer, who was David Patterson, who then went on to a career in television, and Jeff Dean, who was his senior producer. So we were a very small team of 4 of us and some support staff. And the programmes that we made then were Science Now and Scientifically Speaking, which went out on Radio 3 with John Maddox presenting it. And I think it was weekly. And John would turn up, and the thing I remember particularly about him was that he used to bring his secretary with him to type the script. Anyway, John Maddox, as the editor of Nature, as he was at the time, had a fantastic address book, and he interviewed, some were just one-to-one interviews, some were, each programme at 45 minutes would have 2 or 3 interviews in it, but we interviewed all the great scientists of the day.
And this was properly structured broadcasting, was it? I mean, you spent a long time structuring the programme. You presumably wrote the scripts for links, but otherwise it was a structured interview, is that right?
They were structured interviews. The structured interviews that John Maddox did, to be honest, were mostly what John wanted to be asked. Because he was very expert in this area. And at that time, I think Radio 3, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was very highbrow, I think you would say, very cerebral. So there probably wasn't a great deal of role for producers in trying to get him to do things slightly differently at that time. Science Now, which was presented by Peter Evans and Jeff Watts, that was a magazine programme where there was more opportunity for structuring things. And they were all pre-recorded, so they were all edited to for the final programme, which of course we did on 1/4-inch tape at the time.
Yes. Now, was there any travelling around to outside locations, or was it all studio-based?
At that time, I think it was mostly studio-based, though we did get to go. I'm trying to think when I possibly did first interviews on location, because people came into the studio to be interviewed, or we used to use the link-ups through what was called the NCA, News and Current Affairs Network. So you could book a line for someone to go into a studio in a BBC building somewhere else. So there are many people you never saw in person because they lived in Newcastle or Glasgow or somewhere. So they used to go and do that. But of course, it was terribly hard to find people in those days compared with now, when you can just stick their name into Google or stick a subject into Google.
I know. I think it's very easy for people to forget that. I mean, when I did the computer literacy programs, it was almost impossible to find anybody who you could interview, because journalists who knew about the subject were in short supply, as it were. Was this true with science? Yes. Were you looking at journalists or scientists?
More at scientists, I think. I think the kind of watchword of broadcasting in the Radio Science Unit from when I was there, and I think has continued, is to go to the horse's mouth, to talk to the people who are actually doing the research. So if you were doing a magazine programme, you'd have to wait till the journals arrived, because a lot of the stories we did were bits of research that had been published that week. And with science, it's always been very important to respect embargoes. And, the journals will never let you broadcast anything or any interview before their embargo was lifted. Because if you did they'd probably then stop you ever getting press releases about what was going to come out. So the BBC often people who were not science specialists quite often did break embargoes that then meant that everybody was kind of punished for a short amount of time for breaking the embargoes.
Were you ever allowed to record something about something where there was an embargo on the assumption that you didn't broadcast it until after?
Absolutely. We did that all the time. And I think there was a lot of trust and fortunately the programmes at the time, I think, went out on days when, Science Now, like even Inside Science Now, it goes out on a Thursday. I think Science Now went out on a Friday. I'd have to check exactly all the schedules. I think it was on a Friday night, or late afternoon, or Saturday morning at one time, which meant that the embargoes for the science journals were all on Thursday, late on Thursday. Well, Nature was actually Wednesday night. Science was Thursday, which is currently a problem for Inside Science because it goes up before the science embargo goes. But there's lots of other journals, and science broadcasting has moved on, that we're not so dependent on journal publication as we were then.
Did you inherit somebody else's address book, or did you have to build your own?
That's a very interesting question. I suppose I probably did informally, in that I do still have an address book, I think. I'm not sure whether I finally threw it away from the quite early days. As you can tell from the dates by the kind of phone numbers you're writing down.
It's quite
Langham. Well, not quite that far back. I think we just about got to the 580 bit. Just about moved on to that. But it was, there was no 01s and anything like that at the time. So I think what one did was learn from people who've been there longer than I had, who was good to talk to. There's always been a sharing of information. And I think the science broadcasting, the team then were very helpful in suggesting who you should talk to, who you should have as your guests. And even then, there were people who you knew you could kind of rely on, who would come and talk broadly about an area. And that's continued, that everyone's very happy to share. Now people put messages out on WhatsApp to a WhatsApp group saying, who's good to talk about, COVID in Belgium or something, wherever whatever you want. And I think that's how you build up your address book.
Yeah.
And there was a directory. It was like a sort of specialist list. So the universities must have I think it was collected through the universities, had collected names of people who knew about certain subjects, or they were researching certain subjects. So it did help you find people, because sometimes you'd find a paper that was published by, it was interesting science, but the main author was in Japan or somewhere.
Yeah.
And you thought, well, their English isn't likely to be very good. Could we get them with the time difference and all those sorts of things?
Yes,
so you might want to find someone who knew about the area of research in the UK.
You also had to know your periodicals, because some are more prestigious, more trustworthy than others.
Definitely. And so you do, we'd always base on, Nature, as it was, I think it was only one Nature in those days. Now, of course, Nature's hived off into lots of specialist ones. There was Nature and Science, which is published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, were the two main ones. And then if you move slightly further into health, you'd have the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. And then there were some others that were slightly more specialised, so possibly, monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, some of the physics review letters, some of the physics specialist journals.
So you spent a long time reading, by the sound of it.
Well, I did. I think to start with, I think that's what I did spend a lot of my time doing. And of course, we used to get journals as hard copies. And I did just spend quite a lot of time doing that. And there was the opportunity to go to meetings, which was always good. The Royal Society held a lot of great meetings with the world's best people on a certain subject. We used to go to the British Association for the Advancement of Science meetings that moved around the country, that weren't always the latest brand new science, but they gave you an opportunity to talk to people who were keen to communicate.
Now, I want to know a bit about the split, Radio 4, Radio 3, and also World Service. You were presumably doing things for all three, were you?
Not for World Service until 1999. Actually, the World Service had its own separate science unit for a long time.
You did?
Yes, and how that was set up, I don't really know. Martin Redfern is your man to talk to about that. Because sadly the editors of that, there was an editor called John Newell, and then there was an editor called John Wilson, when they were in when the World Service was a separate unit. Sadly, both of them are no longer with us. And so the World Service, it was quite separate from domestic broadcasting, in both geographically and I think kind of editorially as well.
Why was that? Let me just ask you that question. Because the World Service did actually take a lot of domestic programmes and simply rebroadcast them, didn't it?
It did, but I think it possibly because of the funding model, because it was funded directly from the Foreign Office, even though the Foreign Office has always had an arm's length relationship with it. Yeah. And I think there was a very different culture in Bush House, because when we moved over there, I moved over there to work there in '99. You just felt that they did not want these people from domestic moving in at all. There was a very different sort of sense to it. And they were people who knew the world. And I think domestic broadcasting was pretty parochial, really. And they did, even though a lot of them were a generation before would have been working in the Colonial Office, they did know their stuff. They weren't, there were a lot of Brits then. It's only really moved into having people who came from those parts of the world, across the late 20th, early 21st century, I would think. And it's changed. I'm sure somebody must have done a fantastic bit of work about the World Service, because it was an extraordinary outfit.
Of course, it's very easy to think of it only as being the English part of the World Service, but of course it's so many different languages.
Oh yes, even when we were moved over, it was this is kind of long story. What happened was that we kind of carried on doing what we were doing, and the Radio Science Unit expanded, so that we then started Medicine Now, that was Jeff Watts presented, that would have been late 1980, I think, and then we did a lot of ad hoc programming. I think there always had been sort of ad hoc series too, single topic programs. So, for example, I made a program about Greenwich Mean Time, about how that came into being, which I really enjoyed, about railway time and things like that. Yes. And I made one about the Common Cold Unit and the research they did there. And there was a whole process of selling these ideas to the controllers of the networks in a slightly intimidating meetings.
Yes. Now, I'd like to know about that, because you were a scientist in a largely, I suppose, arts-based organisation, which the BBC traditionally was.
Yeah.
How did you feel? Did you feel welcome, or was it a sort of uphill struggle?
I think it was quite an uphill struggle, actually. There really was that sort of sense that science was sort of possibly slightly tolerated. Then it was part of what the BBC did in informing people, but there was that sort of sense that science was somehow kind of separate. I can remember going to a review board, which again is one of those things that the great and the good program review, where they were reviewing some of our science programs, and everybody would always say, "Oh, well, I don't know anything about science." They preface every comment with that. Yeah. Well, it's not something I don't know, but it's something I wouldn't normally listen to. And I can remember we had an interview with Carl Sagan, and he'd had a paper, I think published in Nature, but it might have been somewhere else, about what it was like looking at the world, how you could work out, it's a kind of Gaia hypothesis thing, that you can see if you were in space, could you see that the world has got life in it? What makes where we live a blue planet? Mm-hmm. And I can remember, I think it was Nick Kenyon, who was control of Radio 3 at the time, so that you could work out that would probably have been sometime in the 90s, I would guess, saying, gosh, I suddenly thought this was such an interesting way of looking at the world. And I kind of thought, someone's got what science does. But no, it was quite hard, and science used to get kind of lumped in with it it's never had as much airtime as arts, for example. No. Arts has always had a daily programme on Radio 4 for as long as I can remember. It was Kaleidoscope, was a daily programme, and they used to have other weekend programmes as well, while science would have kind of one science programme, one medical programme, and then it might have another programme on stuff we did on Radio 3. We did do a science arts collaboration called Blue Skies that Steve Jones presented, on Radio 3 in the mid to late 90s, which was a lot of fun to make. I can tell you, I really used to enjoy making that programme. So you'd pick a subject, for example, like size, and then you'd have people talking about it from different perspectives. So I remember in that one I had Vikram Seth reciting a haiku, and he just published his A Suitable Boy, which I think was the longest novel in the English language or something at the time.
From the shortest to the longest, yes.
Yes, exactly. That he came up off the top of his head with a haiku. It was very impressive. And then people talking about miniatures, painting miniatures, and then talking about scales of magnitude in a scientific way as well. So yes. That was fun. And we did often make the Reith lectures, actually. That was another thing that science was allowed into doing the Reith lectures. So I produced the ones with Steve Jones on genetics, which were in 92. They went out at the beginning of 92. There was one with Colin Blakemore in 76 about the brain. That was before I arrived. One with Ian Kennedy about medicine in 1980. John Searle, the philosopher, at some point in the 80s as well.
What was your relationship with television?
Not a particularly close one, actually, at the time. Though people like both David and Jeff, who I worked for, they both went to television. I went on a television attachment. As I said, I ended up going to continuing education, to work on Take Nobody's Word for It.
With George Auckland, yes.
With lovely George, yes. Yes. Which was fantastic fun. With George and a guy called Patrick Titley. Do you remember?
Oh, yes, Patrick indeed.
Yes. It was such a funny team. There was Patrick, who was a senior person on it, who had then me and George, who were both, I think, older than him or similar age anyway, as his APs. And then Ian Fells and Carol Vorderman presenting it. It was a great experience.
It was a great series, actually, yes.
Yeah.
Can I just come back to the Radio 3 thing? So we've got Radio 4, Radio 3.
Yes.
What was the difference in tone?
I think Radio 3 was a bit more like a kind of university seminar, I think. When one went to pitching meetings, they weren't called pitching meetings. I can't remember what the phrase was, but if you wanted to offer an idea to Radio 3, you had to go to a meeting and Ian McIntyre was the controller at the time.
Oh, yes.
And he did run it a little bit, and if they did a review meeting as well, they did run it a little bit like a high table, I would imagine. Not that I went to Oxbridge, but a Durham high table I knew. Yeah. So it was incredibly cerebral, and they did get the world's greatest thinkers speaking on it. And as I said, we did scientific speaking for many years for Radio 3, and they used to buy quite a broad range of documentaries on all kinds of subjects that it was sometimes hard to know why they bought it. So, for example, I made 2 programmes about Indian science in the mid-80s that were for Radio 3, not for Radio 4. And Radio 4 was more newsy, I think, was the difference, that you did newsy regular magazine programmes there.
Now, I want to ask you about hard science versus soft science, because my feeling when I was listening to science in the 80s and so on was that it was largely soft science, i.e. Medicine. Well, not that that's soft, but you know what I mean, non-mathematical, shall we say, and non-physical science, and that was an area that people didn't really go into. You never heard much about chemistry, and you didn't hear very much about theoretical physics. As a physicist, what did you feel about that?
Well, I think that's kind of true. I think there were times when we did quite a lot of basic physics, actually. I think at the times when there was a lot of excitement and new stuff coming out about particle physics. Yes. I think the very big and the very small have always been popular. And the very old and the very new, you might say. Yes. So things like the origin of the universe, the oldest galaxies, we did quite a lot on. And I think, I think chemistry has always had a bit of a tough time getting onto the agenda. Yes. And I think it is about how you can tell a story in, say, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, if you're doing a single item, on something that's going to have some kind of meaning to people's lives.
Yes, yes.
Where you don't have to go into too much mathematics, because you can't really do that on the radio, and you could probably argue you can't do it very well on television either. So I think they're the reasons it has to be something that appeals to an image of of things that we think people are can instantly be made interested in.
But there is an issue here, which is whether you think you can move into difficult areas, but somehow manage to popularise them without making them populist.
Yes, I think the problem is that as soon as you get commissioning editors and controllers who are much more involved in what goes out in your programmes, which is sort of what happened as time went on, that there was a lot more kind of sense of, does the audience understand this? Can the audience get it? How are people listening to the radio or even watching TV? These days, can you expect them to be able to get across that, however well you try and sell it? And it also depends on how good the people you interview are at communicating it, which is another issue, that there have always been some fantastic communicators, and there have always been some people who just can't quite ever make it work.
Does that mean you tend to gravitate towards those people you know are articulate, and therefore it becomes a sort of little club almost?
Well, I think we're always looking to extend the club, more people to join the club. But there are, I think other programmes possibly use the club more than we do, because, of course, many, many more people now do science, which is a great thing. So if you think about something like In Our Time, which is made from a different department, with obviously Melvin Bragg does a particular job on that programme, I would argue that they are more inclined to go to their stage army, as you might call it.
But he has an hour. He can get quite a lot of science into that programme.
Yeah, and he does. And he actually would probably have more difficult science than we would possibly have in a magazine programme, even though what we're talking about is probably the new stuff, something that's just happened.
Yes.
But there is something about the way, because I think it is about, it's because it's Melvin. And I think if someone else did it, you might not get away with it in quite the same way.
Yes.
Some programmes create their own kind of aura around them. And it is incredibly popular in our time. If you really want to know, more than basic on whatever subject it is, then go and listen to In Our Time.
Yes.
And he does have a longer time than we do. So we've always tried to make things possibly slightly more accessible. But it's always been a tension between how do you try and find someone to do it. Now there are some people in the chemistry world who are very good at explaining things. There's someone like Andreas Seller, who's a professor at UCL. Yes, he's brilliant at doing it, but it's taken a long time. I can't think of many others. And chemistry, if it was chemistry, it was sort of became interesting if it was biochemistry, if it had a kind of life angle to it.
Exactly. Yes.
But there's always vehicles that you can create to tell people about things. For example, we did a series about elements that Andrea presented the last lot, which were 5 15-minuters that were sort of celebratory around, we made them a Christmas 2019, that had little bits of science, a little bit of how they were used, a little bit of politics as well, a bit about things like we did one on helium, for example, which is about we really shouldn't be putting them in balloons because we might run out, that sort of thing. But then we did a series before that where we had several series where we had a variety of different presenters who talked about, we did one on iodine and how important that is, particularly for people who are vegan who might not get enough iodine. There's that side of things. We did the one on lead, which had the story of lead in petrol and how that got, why lead is very bad for children developing. So we have managed to get chemistry in different ways. So it's about how you tell the story.
Now, the science unit has really burgeoned, hasn't it? I mean, it's got much larger since you joined it. You said there were just a few people there initially. So how many were working with you when you retired recently?
Well, it's got slightly smaller again, but it sort of peaked at probably, I think it was probably at its biggest when we were in Bush House in the first half of this century, in the first sort of 5 years or so, when the science unit, the World Service Science Unit was quite big, and then that kind of got smaller. Just to backtrack a bit, if people want to know this, the reason the science units came together was that we then became part of Bimedia land. If you might remember, it was fashionable under John Burt to create Bimedia departments and specialists. So, practically everybody ended up in the Bimedia department. So we did become part of science. Mm-hmm. So anyway, they brought the units together and then brought someone else in above me to run them. for a while. Anyway, that lasted for about 2 years, and then we went back into radio again. We went, BBC got reorganised.
Yes,
so,
you didn't have to make television programmes alongside radio, which I thought was extraordinary, really. I mean, expecting people to do that.
Well, actually, in science, they weren't keen on that at all, and they just thought everyone who worked in radio couldn't possibly ever make a television programme. There was that sort of sense of that, you can't possibly do it. And so quite a few people did go on attachment to TV, but they all had to go in at a much lower level. So it was a bit like me when I went to television in the 80s. I went as an AP, even though I was already a producer. I was possibly already even a senior producer in radio. Yeah. And I sort of said, well, you don't mind it for 6 months because you're learning the ropes. But other people, even in the late 90s, went over. They had to go to junior level. So,
yes.
Yeah. So,
yes, no, I remember that was always the case.
Yes. And then I think through various bits of a kind of attrition and money getting tighter, the World Service, we ended up with slightly fewer people in the World Service side. But there must have been 20 odd producers when we first got together, I think. And then now it's down to about 15. No, maybe more than that. Maybe about 20 again, but it's different work. The work has changed, so it's probably around about 20 producers.
Let's talk about how you appoint. Presumably, you could appoint your own producers, could you? Or did you have to inherit them? As, they were given to you, as it were.
Rarely, very occasionally, people have been, said, "Oh, so and so would like to work in science." There's somebody here hasn't got any work. They're at the right level. Move them in. To be honest, that's not very satisfactory. I can't think of anyone who's stayed. It's not really worked. No. Though there are people who've not got a science background who've moved in, but they often find they have to do a little bit of work just to understand how science works. Things like knowing, again, which journals are the ones you should look at, working out what stories we've done before, understanding how to read a science paper, how not to be sort of afraid of asking scientists basic questions, because whatever area you've studied, if you have studied science before, you're going to be working with some material you've never come across before. Yeah. So I think the worst is when you have someone who comes along who's rather in awe of science. Then you don't get a good result out of that.
Sure. But it's no longer, I think, fashionable to say nobody needs to know about science. It has gone up the order, hasn't it, in priorities now?
Yes, I think so. I think there's still the sense that people don't really, people still come in and be commissioners who don't really know anything about it, or haven't studied it beyond GCSE if they've probably forgotten everything they ever learned.
That could work both ways, though, because you can not pull the wool over their eyes, but you can impress them with how important something is, and they wouldn't necessarily understand it themselves. But they'll say,
I don't think they like that. I think people generally want to think that they know, that they're, it's always about how you manage your commissioning editor, that you get the sense that they've come up with the idea.
Yes. So, on the whole, your producers would be people with science backgrounds.
It's a mixture. It's definitely of people, even if people haven't got a science background, they've often come from a science family or a medical family, or they're people who've just loved the material, really interested and prepared to find out about it. Yes. And it's good. It's great to have a real mixture of people, and people who've done journalism before, other people who have just completely obsessed and know everything there is about particular subjects. So it's a great team, that we do. Everyone appreciates the hive mind of the team.
It's obviously useful to have people who aren't scientists who can then say to the scientists, I need to know about this, but I don't understand this bit, I don't understand that bit. Tell me about it so that I can understand.
Yes, it is, but I think it's always best to kind of pretend, put your, whatever you're working on, it's good to have the knowledge at the back of your mind, but I think it's always sensible to assume you're on the side of the listener who doesn't know. So I used to find when I first started, I try not to ever tell anybody I had a physics degree, because as soon as you did, then you'd realise they would start talking in a way that was not going to be helpful to anyone who didn't have a physics degree. So I think you should always just say, I'm a producer, I do know about, and then you can kind of start off by talking as if you don't know very much about the subject. But I think that's the best way to go about it, really.
Yeah. Tell me about a typical week in the unit. I mean, how do you start off? How do you get ideas decided? How do you then work on items? Do you do it as a collaborative thing or what?
A lot of the programmes we do are the kind of, the usual business is weekly programmes. So there's a producer allocated to each programme with a presenter. I'd normally allocate a producer to a programme for 3 months at least. So if you've got a weekly programme, you've got 12, 13 programmes. Some people do it for longer. So that they can really begin to do some forward planning a bit, so that you might well have some stuff in the can, or if something's about to happen. For example, the James Webb telescope is going up into being launched soon, so that's something we've kind of slated. There are some things like that, a science book prize. We've done quite a lot of that in recent years, so you're going to have some interviews on those things. COP26, for example, some big things like that, that you can then put on in the diary. But basically, radio is done with one person, one producer and one presenter. The presenters are usually hired in for a couple of days a week. They're not staff, usually. And so they are, the producer will have a chat with the presenter, possibly the day after they put the programme to bed, get some plans going. The producer will beaver away, get book some interviews, and then the interviews will be done day before it goes out, edited and then scripted and read by the presenter. So there is a kind of pattern to the week if you're doing a weekly. Apart from that, there are then other programmes which come in either single series, things like Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry. Yeah. They are dependent on questions sent in by the audience. We know when they're scheduled. We know when the talent are available, which is quite tricky because they're really busy. And so the producers working on that will have a certain number of days and weeks to make those programmes, but they are doing them much more in their own time. And then there's things like the Life Scientific, again, which is up to, we get the dates with Jim Al-Khalili, who's the presenter, and then, we make them. And, occasionally they're kind of topical, but mostly they're not.
How much say would someone like Jim Al-Khalili have in what he covers?
Well, ultimately, the buck stops with the producer and the editor. So Jim can suggest people, and we might do some of them. And we might not, or we might say, well, we'll do that person later, because what we hired Jim in for is his presentation style, really. And we know more people than he does, probably. He knows people in physics, he knows people at Surrey, where he's based at university. We know a lot more people than that, and it's up to us to keep the balance going so that we don't have too many physicists. So we always have a variety of scientists, and we always do 50-50 men and women.
Now, what about when you get a controversial area such as climate change was a few years ago, when it was controversial, and inevitably you got ex-cabinet ministers coming in and spouting off about climate denial. Presumably that's gone up the agenda too, and it's now something you can't argue against.
Yes. And I don't think we would hardly have ever had a climate denier. In fact, I can't remember having a climate denier on the programme.
What, you didn't have Lord Lawson?
I don't think we ever did. Well, there might be somewhere we might have done. I can't remember having him on because he was always on news programmes.
Yes, quite,
but
he was.
I think the science argument was pretty well established quite a long time ago. The detail wasn't, and it really is only in the last few years we've begun to say this weather phenomena is due to climate change. But I think as far as we've gone, we just assumed it was happening. And in fact, there was an interesting piece of work that Ed Poll did at one point about climate change, how much stuff we'd covered. It might have been from a question from one of the parliamentary committees on it, or the House of Lords committee, I can't remember which one. And there was a few years where we didn't do much on climate. It's sort of kind of, people were just gathering details, and it was a sort of lull before the storm in a way. We'd done a lot, say, in the 90s, then early 2000s it might have been that we didn't, and then it's just gone crazy, obviously, in the last year or so.
No, it's gone crazy largely because of climatic events, do you think?
Yeah, yes.
And that's made people interested in it.
Yes, I think
seriously.
So.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the same thing presumably with COVID. I mean, I've never known so many professors or epidemiologists coming out of the woodwork as we've had in the last couple of years. That must have been an extraordinary challenge, actually.
Well, I think it was, and I think it was about our expertise and knowing who to talk to. And the fact there were some people who we might have interviewed in the past who we thought were doing good stuff and that we thought we should give them airtime, who then ended up coming up with some, slightly left field ideas, who we haven't had on the air. And that's kind of interesting. It was difficult because there were a lot of people out there. And there were a lot of people who moved their research from other areas of medicine into COVID. But they obviously all did know, they were experts in HIV, for example. A lot of people were experts in HIV moved into COVID. Mm-hmm. And then there were people who were ventilation experts, found themselves absolutely at the centre of decisions about how we should live, who we interviewed. So it's been the most extraordinary story to cover, apart from such a difficult time to live through. But it's every week you think, is there more to say? And of course now, as of this week, it's all about Omicron.
Now, does the science unit get consulted by BBC News, for example, if there's a science story coming out?
Occasionally, I would say. And it's mostly about who you know and about personal contacts. Occasionally, the World Service actually were rather good at, the people on the World Service are rather good at that. And the science unit in the World Service Science Unit actually at one point used to provide the news. So the World Service Science correspondent was based in the science unit. And that went on for a few years, probably into about mid-2000, 2005, maybe something like that. And then they decided they didn't need quite so many science correspondents. And there was a tradition of people on World Service sequence programmes ringing up the science unit saying, could you suggest someone? So on the one hand, people are happy to do that. But on the other hand, it got to the point where actually we don't have time to do this. We're not being paid for this. Once it became quite transactional. And also there are very good science and health teams in news itself, with a lot of people who really know their stuff. So I think it's kind of changed over. And then there were things like File on 4. There was a time when one of the editors of File on 4, she used to, every time they did a science or health story, she'd often ask me to have a look at the script, which I was always happy to do. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it gets to the point where money has got so tight, people have got so little time to make their programmes. It would be really a bit of a question in recent years of people doing it out of the kindness of their own heart.
File on 4, Archive Hour, these are series where you get the occasional special, presumably, and that would divert manpower, but it'd be an important programme to do. Well,
it would do, but we also make programmes for those slots too. So we would make at one time we had a output guarantee to do 2 File on 4 type programmes a year, and actually the science unit, because it does have quite a lot of journalism in it, there are people who are very good journalists, make programmes in that slot. So we're a very, very broad range of programme makers who can make all kinds of styles, from one-to-one in-depth interviews to journalistic analyses. I'm trying to think which ones we've done. Exposed quite a lot of scandals and things like people selling dodgy stem cell treatments, things about illegal production of CFCs in some parts of Europe. Yep. And, there's a whole variety of different things that we can do, to magazine programmes, to more comedy, lighter touch programmes like The Infinite Monkey Cage and Curious Cases, and then global discussions, debates. So we do all styles of programme. I think the one bit, we've even done, we do a lot of historical programmes as well, ones where we have used actors as well. But I don't think we've ever done any straight dramas, or if we have, that was a long time ago.
No, but you did comedy with Monkey Cage.
Exactly, well, comedy, science and comedy. Yeah. So, and the science is always the best science you can do. We're not skimping on the science, whatever we're doing.
Right. Now, you got an MBE for your work on science.
I did, actually.
Amazing.
In 2009, so quite a long time ago now, which I was completely surprised at.
You weren't expecting it?
No, not at all, No, we were in a different department then. I think it must be, because the BBC do whether they suggest people to the palace or whatever, however it works. So I was very honoured. Didn't get the Queen. I got Princess Anne, Princess Royal, who actually I had met once before. She was president of the British Science Association at one time, and I had been introduced to her once before.
What about the whole business of work-life balance? Being a woman in the BBC, particularly a couple of decades ago, was it difficult, or did you manage to balance it perfectly easily?
Yeah, well, I've always worked pretty hard. I've always worked more than my hours, I would say. But I think the good thing about radio is you are much more in control of when you work. compared with television.
Yes.
When if you're doing television, you're off, yes, you know, you're off on a shoot, you're off in an edit suite somewhere, and everybody just carries on till it's done. While in radio, you could, when my children were younger, I could say, right, I'm going home now, I'll pick up this, you can call me in the evening, you know, when my children were little. So I've always worked full time, actually, because I felt I was one of those people, if I didn't work full time, I would have worked the hours and not got paid for it, so I might as well just work full time.
Yes, quite. Now, I think that this is a golden period for radio. I mean, I have always been a consumer of radio. I've never worked in radio, I always worked in television, and television, to me, you can keep it, really, whereas the radio is fantastic, I think. And I know you've had loads of cuts recently, and it must be quite difficult juggling that. But do you think radio's in a healthy state?
Oh, well, I think it is. I think it's the renaissance through podcasting, really. As it's not the first time people have tried to do podcasts, but somehow, just in the last few years, they've just taken off. And everybody's doing podcasts to variable qualities. I don't know what it is, whether it is the sort of sign of sort of decline. You know, there's hardly any science on television, on British television at the moment, is there? You know, there's the odd series that Brian does, but there's hardly anything else. And all the, you know, Jim has made a lot of, Uncle Ely's made a lot of great programmes for BBC Four, but they seem to have probably stopped commissioning them as well.
Yes, they do, which is tragic.
It is. I can't quite understand that. So I think radio has just carried on doing what it does. You know, we churn stuff out, we make it, you know, it's all made in fairly short time scales. There's lots of opportunity for experimenting without, you know, if you make a programme or two and they're not quite what the commissioning editors want, you could just say, okay, well, that didn't work, we'll try something different. Not that I can think of anything that was a complete disaster, but you know, you can just keep trying and you can try something else. So I think it's in a way, and also because we do have these sort of continuing strands, that you've got lots of opportunity for trying things out. And it's not, it is also, you know, I would say it is also about having a team of people who know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a long time. You've always got the danger of complacency, but actually, you know, people, you can rely on them to do things. Yeah. You know, you need a mixture of people who've been there a long time and new people who are coming in with new ideas. And there have been times in recent years when there hasn't been that opportunity to get new people in. You know, going back to recruitment, a lot of it has been about people going and not getting more people in. So it's the same in, you know, all industry. And I don't know if it's the same in TV, but it has been about, right, you've got to make a simpler programme. You've got to have less time. You've got fewer days to make that programme. You'll have to make it simpler. And there is that sense people have got great pride in what they do and they don't want to skimp.
They don't want to. No,
and it becomes a real difficulty because there is much more sense of work-life balance now. You know, the BBC has said, or our department has said, we don't want people working more than that, 35 hours a week, which is quite difficult.
No. How much of a problem has the pandemic made, because people have been working from home, not meeting in the office, presumably? I mean, it's very good for certain things, but it may be not so good for others.
Yes. What was really extraordinary is that we just kind of managed to keep the show on the road throughout by doing stuff using this kind of technology, or to make recordings, to edit from home, to send stuff around. You know, I think the limitations have been mostly how good people's Wi-Fi is, and people have been going in small bits. I think it's much harder because the kind of sitting around and sharing ideas and talking things through, you know, we've really missed out on that. And I think it just takes a lot longer to think, right, I'm going to talk to so-and-so for an hour and then I'm going to talk to somebody else for an hour, rather than working in the office. So having said that, a lot of people, we didn't all come into the office every day because we worked at a big open plan office that was very noisy, and a lot of people did do a couple of days a week at home because they could concentrate.
Well, I was wondering a bit about that, having always had an office when I was working, and you presumably had an office originally, but then moving to BH, which was very much open plan, and you know, people needing to wear headphones in order to concentrate, I suppose. Well,
it just became an issue that people just said, well, I'm not coming in, I'm going to work from home, because we've had laptops for 15 years, I think. Everyone has a laptop and they could do most of it from home.
Yeah, sure. But the technology had really improved in the last couple of years. As you say, I mean, we're recording this using a bit of BBC software, I believe. But that wouldn't have been possible just a few years ago.
No, it wouldn't have been at all. And Zoom, I think I'd used Zoom once or before the pandemic started. With someone in engineering who said, "Oh, we can talk to each other on Zoom." I'm thinking, "Oh, what's that?" No, I know it would have been so much harder if this technology wasn't available. Yeah. It has meant that radio can keep broadcasting.
Yeah. Now tell me about your most successful, perhaps your biggest failures.
Perhaps you won't admit to this was the hardest question that you'd sent me.
I know.
Actually, I thought maybe you'd forgotten this one.
No.
I don't know. It's because we make so many programs that you just go through it and you think, okay, that one was okay, that one worked really well, let's move on to the next one. Yes. But there are things that
but the science unit had some awards.
Yes. Well, things like the Infinite Monkey Cage, I think, really did set a new style of programming that has now been kind of emulated by history with things like You're Dead to Me. That whole different style. I think I think what we're really proudest of is changing the tone of science broadcasting. That a lot of it is, we've got some great younger presenters. Not so that age is important in this, but people who can just talk about science with enthusiasm and energy, which is really what you need. Like Robin O'Brien or Adam Rutherford and Hannah Fry, lots of other people. When we worked with Chris Van Tulleken, there's lots of them. People who are just great broadcasters who bring quite a lot of wit. I think that's the thing. It's not just we're talking about serious stuff, but you can talk about it in a witty way, and it doesn't have to be all gloom and doom, which is what I've always thought people should avoid that.
How do you train presenters, or are they born not made?
You come across someone, you think, God, they're a good communicator. Can they move to the other side of the microphone, so to speak? And can they be good at presenting? And you're not really ever sure until you give them a chance to do it. These days, of course, in a way it's easier because people have often done the odd podcast or they've presented something on YouTube. So it's easier to find out if they're really good at it. But there's also the trick of also being able to read a script because and make it sound like they're not reading a script, which is often the hardest thing of that. And I think it's just, again, about somebody, it's experience that whether you think someone's ever going to make it or not.
And particularly if you're doing live stuff, I was thinking Quentin Cooper, who's very adept at dealing with live material. Yes, live versus recorded. What do you give us some thoughts about live versus recorded?
Well, as a producer, it's all very exciting doing live programming. And the advantages are once it's done, it's done. You set it all up and then it all goes in half an hour or 45 minutes, however long your program is. We do less and less of it. And I'm not sure why, partly because once Material World Stopped and Inside Science started, some presenters aren't as confident doing live. I think you also know you can get a better result from people unless you go to Stage Army when you're not doing things live. There was a case in some cases of Material World where you'd have someone on who was quite inexperienced who completely froze, and you don't get that if you're pre-recording. And if you do want to get new people in, it's that fine line between are they going to be able to perform live, or actually would they be much happier doing a pre-rec? Unlike politicians always like to do it live. Yes. So you can't edit it. So it's a fine line between the two. And I think we just stopped because quite a lot of the programmes went out at times that a lot of them originate in the evening. People don't want to work evenings. Studios weren't available. So for a lot of practical reasons. And I think now, interestingly, as we get more producers who come from the podcast world, they don't have the live experience. So they have to be taught how to produce a live programme.
Well, there are a lot of podcasts are done as if they're live.
Yeah, I know, but there's no constraint on them in time-wise, is there? When you've got to get out, you've got to hit, you've got a hard post, you've got to hit.
No.
So I think people aren't quite...
The danger with that, I presume, is you ramble if you're not careful.
Yes, and quite a lot of podcasts do possibly ramble on a bit long.
Yes.
So,
but what is the podcast doing to the schedule? I mean, I still think the schedule is terribly important because they're fixed points in the day. You know where they are. You can always go back to them on the iPlayer, which is effectively still being part of the schedule.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think that's possibly an old-fashioned way of looking at things. I know my daughter, well, my kids, both of whom listen to a lot of podcasts, would never make a date with a schedule. They just look at when something is available, when it's there, and listen to it.
Yes, I suppose that's true. You still value the schedule, though, presumably.
Oh, yes. And I think, I'm kind of possibly a bit old-fashioned at this, that I like the discipline of a duration, because it means that you can make a nice tight programme. And even though we do make quite a lot of programmes that, your first edit, you might put that out as a podcast, because then that's out of the way, and then you'll edit it down to the programme length. I think things are possibly better when they do stick to a schedule, and I think there is still it is interesting in a case of whether you should, you have to think about the time of day when people are listening to a programme, and who is listening at that time.
Yes. Tell me about the audience and about times of day. I mean, there are graveyard slots, I imagine, or you would think of them as graveyard slots.
Yes. Well, the radio audiences are inverse to television. So they're higher in the morning, they dip a little bit mid-morning, come back up at lunchtime, dip a little in the afternoon, and then the sort of drive time, and then they dip away in the evening, and then come back up at bedtime. I think that's what it used to be like. I think the pandemic has probably changed a lot of that because of people not commuting so much. But a good slot is 9 a.m. in the morning for a programme, because and we know that from the Life Scientific, that a lot of people know the Life Scientific because it goes out at 9 a.m, like in our time, Desert Island Discs and Start the Week.
Because it follows a Today programme.
It does. And even, when people, you thought, well, surely you should be at work at this time, you find quite a lot of people were listening to the programme, which was good. The more graveyardy type of slots are the mid-afternoon and mid-evening, where a lot of the science was put originally. But actually we get a lot more stuff in the daytime now.
And also you can listen often to slightly longer versions on the iPlayer. On BBC Sounds.
On Sounds, yes.
Keep getting the name wrong, which is good. Do we know what size the audience is?
We know roughly. It's quite done by quarter, really. So you can tell, but it's not. And radar who do the measurements, was suspended during the pandemic, which I couldn't really understand why, but because I'm sure a lot of it's done remotely, but they did suspend it. So I think we've only had one lot of figures since which would have been second quarter of this year, I think. So it's nowhere near as detailed. You don't get overnights like you do in television.
No,
unfortunately. So but it still makes still more people probably listening to linear radio than there are listening to podcasts.
Overall, the audience sizes are still quite healthy, aren't they?
They are pretty healthy. Yes. I think the BBC it's about 50-50 with independent radio. Of course, most independent radio is music radio. And Radio 4 holds its own pretty well. Even World Service gets quite good UK-based audience, particularly overnight for the Insomniacs. Radio 2, I think, is still the biggest, but it still cuts through to quite a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, and Radio 3, you're still doing material for Radio 3?
Hardly, very very little these days. We might do the odd doc, Sunday feature. We were involved in the some big events that we did with Welcome Collection. We did Wine Music, and then we did Memory, wasn't it? The second one, we did two events there, which were great to be part of those kinds of things. So we don't do as much for Radio 3 these days.
Is that resources or?
Yes, I think it's more resources. I just think things, people just don't have the resources to do these big projects because they do take a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, but the danger is that people think, radio's easy. It doesn't cost you anything to make radio, so we'll just cut its budget.
Yeah. Well, you've got a quite small budget, and it's basically most of the money goes on people. And if you have fewer people, then you just can't make it because people won't. Without people, working many, many more hours than they're paid for.
Yeah, it's interesting this because you and I are still almost talking as if we're working in the BBC still. So you haven't quite left, but regret or not at going?
Well, the reason that finally precipitated me to leave is that the unit's being moved to Cardiff. So, and I think at my stage of career, I'm not moving to Cardiff.
No.
So I think it's good for someone else to take it over, and it's going to be, I've been through so much change, changes of commissioning editors, change of location, change of programs, change of personnel, everything. It gets to the point when, after the number of years I've been here, I think I'll let someone else do it.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm quite relieved not to have to deal with all the agony that is happening. It's very hard for the team, many of whom have been there, as I said, have been there a very long time. They're very rooted in their communities. They've got elderly parents, kids in schools, all those sorts of things that even if they wanted to move, partners who do jobs that are, they wouldn't be able to do in Cardiff. Property they don't want to sell in the southeast to move to Cardiff. So all those kind of things are going to make it really hard to what's going to happen to the science unit.
Yeah, and also presumably most of their time they're in London. I mean, doing recordings and things here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's all going to be very different in the future.
Yes, quite. Well, would it be different? How? I mean, okay. Do you think it's going to affect the output?
Well, it shouldn't do, because the output's been commissioned to be a certain thing. But there's always change going on, and there will be change in the Inside Science or Science Magazine, whatever it's going to be called, because we've just won the tender to keep it, but it's going to have to change in some way. Things are always evolving, so I don't think that's a problem, and I think that's absolutely right. Well, Service is a new commissioning team that's come in too, so whoever's in, the person who's been Martin Smith, who's taking over and who's based in Wales already, he will have to create relationships with them. So there may well be a lot of change coming up. There may be future cuts as well. So I don't know quite how it's going to go. But you just get to the point where, I've seen through so many things. It might change. It might change.
But that's interesting, because I had forgotten the whole business of competition, as it were, with independent producers. Do you see yourself as an independent producer for the science unit?
What, in the future? No. No, I don't think that would be. I think that would be. I just think it would be very strange. And no one's approached me yet. Though, as I said, I'm officially not out the door till the end of the year.
Yes.
I think it would be. I think it would be. I just think it would be the wrong thing to do, for me to turn up working for an indie. People who've worked in the unit have some have set up indies. This is going back a few years now, and they've hired in other people who've worked in the team in the past to do a little bit of editorial work, consultancy, a couple of days or something like that. But I think it would be wrong for me to pitch ideas against my old team.
Yes. Nonetheless, a very impressive career, if I might say so, Deborah.
Oh, thank you. Might just been that I've just stayed there a very long time.
Yes, well, I hope you're proud of yourself.
Yeah.
I'm certainly proud of your output, if one can be proud of somebody else's output.
Oh, thank you.
That's okay. Well, thanks very much indeed for doing this.
Oh, well, that's fine. Well, I hope I gave you something that will be of interest.
Well, it was good stuff, actually, and I hope I didn't interrupt you too much.